leads me on to welcoming our next speaker, so Neil Simcock from Liverpool John Moores University, who will expand a little bit on energy justice. So over to you, Neil.
Yeah, thanks, Harriet. Thank you for the invitation to be here as well. I'm really looking forward. Rosie, it was a great talk. I'm looking forward to hearing the rest of them as well. I'm going to crack on because I've only got 9 minutes. So I'm going to talk very briefly about energy justice for a slide or two. I saw that most of you already have some familiarity with energy justice, so I'll keep it fairly broad and brief. And then I'm going to spend a few slides talking about how might the capabilities approach connect with energy justice and what are some of the challenges to that. So it builds on quite nicely actually to some of the themes that Rosie was talking about there. So next slide, if I can get it working, here we go. Okay, so energy justice, how do we actually define that? Well, it doesn't really have a precise definition in the literature. If you read a different paper, each of them might have a slightly different definition. But the way I would understand it, and I think broadly this is correct, is that energy justice is about understanding and analysing energy systems in terms of their justice implications. So it's about applying ideas of justice to actually look at the normative and the moral aspects of energy systems. And normally when we talk about energy justice, you're probably also familiar, we tend to talk about what's called 3 tenets or 3 forms of energy justice that are taken from the environmental justice literature that preceded it. So first of all, we tend to talk first about distributional justice. So this is really in many ways sort of the foundational concept of justice, if you go back to the original philosophical literature. And this is basically asking the question, who gets what? So we can think about that in terms of money and other kinds of resources, like maybe housing, for example. But if we're talking about it maybe in terms of energy, we might talk about who's getting adequate energy services in the home. We might talk about who's getting the benefits and who's getting the burdens of different kinds from energy systems. Then alongside that, we could also think about procedural justice. So this is really more about questions of who has power, and it's about fairness in decision making rather than fairness in terms of outcomes. So in terms of energy justice and energy systems, we might think procedural justice questions might be along the lines of who's participating, who's being represented in energy policy making and other kinds of relevant decision making. And then finally, we could think about recognition justice. So in many ways, I suppose this is the most foundational, some people would argue the most foundational and fundamental of the 3. And this is really about the question of who is respected. So you might think about that in terms of, say, racism, for example. Racism is an injustice, we couldn't reduce that solely to certain races getting less in terms of being poorer or getting fewer resources. It's also more fundamentally a matter of respect and certain groups of people being respected less than others. And just quickly to make the point as well, these 3 forms of justice are generally seen as being interconnected and related rather than wholly separate. Okay, so where does the capabilities approach fit with energy justice? Well, again, there's no single agreed way on this, and different people may have different opinions on it. I think one common way of looking at it would be to see capabilities as connecting most strongly to distributional justice. So really, this is a view that sees capabilities as the things that are being distributed rather than, for example, material goods or other kinds of primary goods or material resources. An alternative way that some people in environmental justice literature have proposed is that procedural justice and recognition justice issues can also be related to certain valued capabilities. And this is an approach, say, that David Schlossberg has used. For me, I'm not wholly convinced that either of these 2 approaches works. I mean, I think it's strange in some ways to talk about distributing capabilities, because capabilities aren't sort of things that we can just sort of hand out to people and share out in the same way that we might consider that we could do that with money or other kinds of resources. It doesn't really make sense to me to apply a logic of distribution to them. So my own personal view on this, I mean, other people have this view as well, it's not only me, but the way I like to look at it is that really distributional justice, procedural justice, recognition, they are almost preconditions that are valuable because they enable people to achieve certain capabilities. So you achieve justice in terms of distribution, procedure and recognition. That enables people to then have secondary capabilities and ultimately primary capabilities as well. So basically the kind of ultimate normative goal in what we're trying to achieve in having a fair distribution of resources and having fair decision making and having recognition and respect for all people, that's ultimately so we can enable people to have primary capabilities or to have the capabilities they need for a flourishing life. So we effectively we make a judgment about whether justice is achieved in each of these dimensions based on whether people are able to have the capabilities they need for a flourishing life. So that's really how I personally see the connection. It's the one that most makes sense to me. I just want to quickly talk as well, just to give you a quick example of how we might apply the capabilities approach to energy systems, but also to assessing energy poverty and making a judgment about justice and injustice in relation to energy poverty. So if we take Nussbaum's theory of central capabilities that Rosie introduced earlier, and as Rosie said, Nussbaum argues that there are fundamentally 10 what she calls central capabilities that she sees as kind of the prerequisites or the requirements for a life that's commensurate with human dignity. So they're sort of the basic minimum that everyone requires. And the way she looks at it is that material goods, such as energy services, social relationships, which we could argue potentially connect to recognition, and also democratic political systems, which maybe connect to procedural justice, these are kind of prerequisites or preconditions that enable people to achieve those 10 central capabilities. And she also presents this as a theory of justice as well, or what she calls a partial theory of justice, because she basically argues that if any person falls below what she calls a threshold level for any of those central capabilities, that is a form of injustice, because we need all 10 of them in order to have a life that's commensurate with human dignity. So if people fall below any of the 10, then that is a form of injustice in her words. So what we might consider doing then for energy poverty research is to actually examine how energy poverty has an impact upon people's ability to achieve those central capabilities. And this is actually, there's some work that started to do this. It's a recent paper by Francois, who you'll hear later, and also by Rosie as well. It's come out in the Journal of Human Development and Capabilities that sort of starts to do this approach. I've also got with some colleagues a forthcoming paper coming out in local environment doing something very similar. So what we did some interviews with households living in energy poverty. We analysed them and we looked at how energy poverty was affecting their life and was it having an impact on any of these central capabilities. And the answer that we found was yes, it was impacting upon, we found 7, so 7 of the 10, the ones I've got underlined here on the diagram. And then you can start to make a judgment about maybe start to make some claims about justice or injustice. One of the challenges, however, to this approach that we found is Nussbaum talks about injustice occurring when a person falls below a threshold level of those central capabilities. But she's very vague about what that threshold level actually is. So how do we know when someone has got enough of a central capability? How do we know when it's been harmed severely enough to call it an injustice? So when we were writing this paper, we had some real challenges in terms of actually trying to make a claim of injustice for this very reason, because we weren't sure where exactly the threshold level would or could be set. Okay, final reflections. I'm almost on time, which is good. So questions in terms of operationalizing capabilities in energy justice. So first of all, there's the question that Rosie mentioned about which capabilities matter if we're going to make claims about energy justice. Secondly, the question I just talked about as well, how do we actually go about setting the threshold of capability below which an injustice actually occurs? Thirdly, and this is something I'm looking forward to hearing more from in the later speakers, a challenge for me is always how do we actually measure capabilities to make a judgment about injustice? So remember, what we're really interested in is capabilities, not functionings. But to me, it feels very difficult to actually measure how do we know if someone has a genuine opportunity to achieve a functioning or not. So that's a real challenge. And then finally, maybe this doesn't relate so much to energy poverty, but I think it does relate to energy justice. Is the capabilities approach useful for dealing with justice issues that relate to excessive energy demand? I think Rosie was sort of saying that it was, and I partly agree with that, but I still think it's an interesting question for discussion. So anyway, I will finish there. Sorry for running a minute over, but here's my email, Twitter handle, and looking forward to the discussions.